This is the Onco'Zine Brief with Peter Hofland.
In this episode of the Onco'Zine Brief, I talk with Dr. Richard Schilsky. Dr. Schilsky is the Chief Medical Officer and Executive Vice President of the American Society of Clinical Oncology, ASCO, and specializes in new drug development and treatment of gastrointestinal cancers. His impressive experience and many accomplishments in both clinical medicine and clinical research reflect his deep passion for cancer medicine. As a highly respected leader in the field of clinical oncology, Dr. Schilsky has spent his majority of his career at the University of Chicago, where he joined the faculty in 1984. In 2013, he joined ASCO, where he launched ASCO's first ever prospective clinical trial, the Targeted Agent and Profiling Utilization Registry, or TAPUR Study. Dr. Schilsky also established the Center for Research and Analytics, developed a board-approved policy on research scope, set up a process to review and fulfill requests for ASCO data, built a division of Biostatistics and Research Data Governance, and initiated ASCO's Research Survey Pool to support surveys of ASCO members for research purposes. Being at the forefront of cancer medicine, Dr. Schilsky also worked on developing ASCO's Cancerlink, which helped define a real-world evidence research strategy in cancer care, recognizing early on that big data can help us learn from every cancer patient's experience, not just from the 3% of patients who are able to participate in clinical trials. In February 2021, Dr. Schilsky will be retiring from his role of Chief Medical Officer at the American Society of Clinical Oncology. In our interview today, I talk with Dr. Schilsky about ASCO and the progress made in the treatment of cancer. I'm Peter Hofland, and this is the Onco'Zine Brief. The Onco'Zine Brief is developed in collaboration with our online journal, Onco'Zine, at onco'zine.com, where you can find additional information and the latest news about cancer, cancer diagnosis and treatment, and cancer prevention. For more information on how to support the program, visit our website at onco'zine.com. And if you're living in the United States and want to receive our newsletter, text the word cancer to 66866. And we will make sure that you'll receive our newsletter, which includes an overview of the latest news in oncology and hematology. Now, let's listen to our interview with Dr. Richard Schilsky. On the phone with me is Dr. Richard Schilsky. He's the Chief Medical Officer of the American Society of Clinical Oncology. Dr. Schilsky, welcome to the Onco'Zine Brief.
Thank you, Peter.
So you are retiring in February 2021 after a long career in oncology. Now, looking back at your career, let's look a little bit at the beginning of your career. What made you become, or maybe want to become, a doctor?
Well, I knew from a young age that I wanted to be a doctor. I don't know exactly how I made that decision, but I actually have documentation of a short essay that I wrote as a homework assignment when I was in 6th grade called My Ambition. And in it, I wrote about the fact that I wanted to be a doctor so I could help people heal. But more importantly, I wrote even then that I wanted to be a medical researcher so that I could help to discover new cures for different diseases. And so that was 6th grade, so I was pretty clear on my goals at that point. The rest of my education sort of followed with that in mind. I was pre-med in college. I went to medical school. Along the way, in the late 1960s, my grandmother, with whom I was very close, developed breast cancer. And I watched her go through a fairly protracted illness that extended over a number of years, where she developed breast cancer in one breast and at that time was treated with what was considered the standard of care, which was radical mastectomy followed by chest wall radiation, quite a disfiguring treatment. Some years later, she developed a breast cancer in the other breast, had the same disfiguring treatment, eventually developed disseminated disease with bone and brain metastases, and there was very little that could be done at that time other than various hormone therapies that were effective for a short period of time. So that impacted me a lot. When I was in medical school, the only time I had off from school was the summer between my first and second years of medical school. And I had an opportunity to spend some time during that summer hanging out, if you will, in the radiation therapy department at New York University Medical Center, which was nearby my home in New York City. And I got a chance really to spend time following the doctors around and talking to the patients and, seeing up close, the struggles that these patients had, many of whom had locally far advanced cancer and were getting palliative radiation treatment. And that, again, sort of further galvanized my interest in cancer as a disease or, set of diseases that were so devastating at the time, were so expansive in their impact on a patient's well-being, could affect any part of the body, any organ system, had enormous impact on, patients' ability to carry on a normal lifestyle. So I went back to school, then came under the mentorship of, a very prominent oncologist of that day, John Altman, who was the director of our cancer center at the University of Chicago, and was a leader himself in studying Hodgkin's and non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. And he served as a role model and a mentor to me. And as I pursued my training further and got interested in internal medicine, it put me on the path then to specializing ultimately in medical oncology. I did my fellowship training at the National Cancer Institute, where I had a wonderful experience with lots of great mentors. And that's how I became an oncologist.
Right. So your early experience of seeing your grandmother with breast cancer ultimately led to somebody that was very eager in trying to find a solution for people suffering from different forms of cancer.
Absolutely. And, and it was that experience. It was the fact that, I loved the clinical challenge that was presented by caring for patients with cancer because, there were so many medical problems that those patients experienced. And then, of course, as I learned more and more about the underlying biology of cancer and what was still not well understood, and then as it became better understood over the ensuing years, the biology of the disease just became intellectually captivating. I mean, there is no area in medicine, I think, that is more interesting and confounding at the same time than cancer. But we've made such progress over the last 40 years in understanding the disease. That's really what has fueled all of the progress that we've made in treating cancer in recent decades.
Now, your focus is on gastrointestinal cancers as well as drug development. So the researcher that you wanted to be when you were in sixth grade basically has become, you fulfilled that desire, you fulfilled that, right? Now, why did you choose to work in gastrointestinal cancers? Was there a specific reason for that?
Well, so remember when I sort of got involved in studying those cancers, which was late 1970s, there were very few treatments available. And so my interest in drug development and my interest in GI cancer aligned very well because there were huge unmet medical needs. There were very few drugs that were effective in treating GI cancer. In fact, the only drug available at the time that had any effectiveness was the drug 5-fluorouracil or 5-FU, which is still one of the mainstay drugs in treating GI cancer today. I was working at the time in a laboratory at the National Cancer Institute that was studying anti-metabolite drugs like 5-FU, like methotrexate, and we were studying how to optimize those drugs and enable them to work better. The two areas converged because that was a group of drugs that were used commonly in treating GI cancers. GI cancers were also diseases that were common, where there was a huge unmet medical need. There was an urgent need for developing new therapies. And, many of the patients, particularly those with colorectal cancer, had a sort of long enough trajectory of their illness that they were great candidates to participate in clinical trials because they were clinically well enough for long enough that you actually had the opportunity to use them as research participants to understand whether or not new treatments were working.
Yeah, and if you look at the GI medicine in GI cancers today, a lot have changed. There's more possible right now. Tell me a little bit about that evolution within the GI cancer development.
Well, certainly we've made progress, but I would say that we've not made as much progress as quickly as I would have hoped, and not as much progress as we've made in other difficult to treat solid tumors like lung cancer or melanoma, for example. And it's largely because we still don't have as complete an understanding of the biology of many GI cancers as we do for in some of these other areas.
Let's take a break, and then we're back with our interview with Dr. Richard Schilsky, the Chief Medical Officer and Executive Vice President of the American Society of Clinical Oncology, ASCO. I'm Peter Hofland, and this is the Onco'Zine Brief.
Sarcoma. Odds are you've never heard that word before. But for the 40 people diagnosed with sarcoma every day, it is a life-changing word. Life-changing and devastating because sarcoma is cancer. Sarcoma is a cancer of bone and soft tissue more prevalent in children than in adults. More than 6,000 people lose their lives to sarcoma each year. Treatment options for sarcoma are limited, and new therapies are desperately needed. More research and increased awareness is necessary to find a cure for a cancer that you probably didn't even know existed until now. Through awareness, advocacy, and research, the Sarcoma Foundation of America is determined to help those affected by this forgotten cancer, to bring hope to the children and adults whose lives are forever changed by a word they had never heard before. Please help us in the fight to find the cure for sarcoma. For more information on sarcoma and the work of the Sarcoma Foundation of America, please go to curesarcoma.org.
This is the Onco'Zine Brief with Peter Hofland.
And welcome back. I'm Peter Hofland, and this is the Onco'Zine Brief. In today's program, I talk with Dr. Schilsky about ASCO and the progress made in the treatment of cancer.
We had this foundational drug, 5-FU, introduced really in the 1950s, optimized for use through clinical trials in the 1970s and 80s. And then we had really no advances until 10 or 15 years after that, when the second, really foundational drug in GI cancer entered the clinic, and that was oxaliplatin. So those two drugs together really, now are the foundation for most standard chemotherapy regimens in all GI diseases. And then it was another 15 or 20 years before we saw the introduction of the first targeted therapies in GI cancer, with both bevacizumab and cetuximab being introduced, both producing modest benefits in people with advanced colorectal cancer, and then very disappointingly, both of those drugs failing miserably in adjuvant chemotherapy studies. And that was almost a big setback to the whole targeted therapy field in GI cancer, because we couldn't really understand why those drugs would work in advanced disease but not work in earlier stage disease. And I think we still don't fully understand that. But that said, as the research continued to develop, in more recent years, we've seen more rapid progress, we've seen now the introduction of newer targeted therapies sometimes in very difficult diseases like the use of PARP inhibitors, olaparib in particular, in pancreatic cancer. We've seen the introduction of immune checkpoint inhibitor therapies in both upper GI and colorectal cancers. We've begun to identify subsets of patients with both gastrointestinal cancer and even colon cancer that have HER2 amplified tumors. that seem to benefit from HER2-directed therapy. And of course, Herceptin is already FDA approved in gastric cancer that's HER2 amplified. And there's emerging data about the utility of those therapies in patients with HER2 amplified colon cancer. More recently, we've seen a much better genomic characterization, gallbladder and biliary tract cancer, and the identification of targets there in fibroblast growth factor receptor and other targets that provide opportunities now for new classes of drugs to be introduced in treating those diseases. So the pace of progress over the last 40 years has been slower than we might have liked, but I think it's accelerating just in the last decade, although we still got a ways to go.
Well, absolutely. But it is remarkable to see that there is still a lot of progress. Now, when you look at gastrointestinal cancers, there's also an evolution in some of the other aspects, like diagnostics, for example. And that's interesting. People are looking right now at earlier diagnostics. They have different ways of doing the diagnostic things. Why is that so important in diseases like gastrointestinal cancers?
Well, what's important in every kind of cancer really is early diagnosis. The sooner you can diagnose the cancer, and presumably it's at an earlier, more curable stage, the more likely you are to actually be able to cure it. And I think it's important to remember that when you look at solid tumors across the board, right now, roughly 2/3 of patients with solid tumors are potentially curable. We focus a lot on the patients who have far advanced metastatic disease, where we still have a lot of work to do to get those cancers into remission. But, there's a substantial cure rate for many kinds of cancer now if the cancer is caught early enough. And so understanding who's at high risk of developing certain cancers, introducing new and better screening tests to detect those cancers at a very early stage, those are really going to be the transformative, approaches going forward, as well as the progress that we, I'm sure we'll continue to make in developing new therapies.
Yeah, so it's the interplay of diagnostics, the earlier the better, and with some of the diagnostic tools that are out there, we see that it is possible to really go very early in some of the diagnostic process, and at the same time working really hard on developing the tools to treat the cancer.
For sure.
Now, you are the Chief Medical Officer of the American Society of Clinical Oncology. When you started, this was a new position. I think you started in 2013 in this particular position. What changed within the ASCO organization, and what made your role important in that respect?
Yeah, I did start in 2013, after really a long history of association with ASCO. And, I became an ASCO member in 1980 at the first opportunity to join. I participated in many ASCO committees over the ensuing years. I was elected to serve on the ASCO board of directors and then subsequently as ASCO president. So I had a long and a very productive and enjoyable history working with ASCO. And when they created this new position of Chief Medical Officer, I was at a point in my career where, I was sort of looking around for something new and refreshing to do. I had, by that point in my career, I had already been the director of a cancer center. I had already been the chairman of a cooperative group. I had been the head of a hem-onc division in an academic medical center. I had done all these jobs, and I thought, well, okay, what's left for me that would still be energizing? And then this position at ASCO came along, and I thought, perfect. It's an organization that I know and love, and they're giving me a blank slate to build out a new position. So when I started at ASCO, of course, there were certain elements to my role that were important then and continue to be important, working on developing ASCO's policy positions, working on, ASCO's communication with the public and with the profession about things that are important to oncology patients and care providers. But one of the things that was clear to me was that although ASCO was a major vehicle for disseminating research results generated by others. ASCO itself was really not participating in research or contributing to research. And, I'd spent really my entire career up to that point doing clinical research and clinical trials, and it was what I knew how to do well. And I thought, well, why can't ASCO also do research? And so we set out, and have built over the last 8 years quite an expansive research enterprise at ASCO, starting really in 2016 with the launch of ASCO's first clinical trial, the TAPUR Study, which is ongoing still today, and we hope will continue for a number of years into the future. We developed that clinical trial. In doing so, we needed to create a highly skilled staff to manage the trial, and we ultimately did so, and then organized that staff into a new unit at ASCO that we call the Center for Research and Analytics, or CENTRA. And CENTRA is now really the hub of all of ASCO's research activities. In addition, we determined that there were opportunities for ASCO members to advance their own research by conducting surveys of other ASCO members, addressing issues that are important to oncology care delivery or other aspects of ASCO of oncology research. So we created a mechanism whereby we now conduct surveys on behalf of ASCO members to survey other members of the profession on high priority issues. And then finally, I'll just mention that, because we had developed all this infrastructure, when the COVID-19 pandemic swept across our country earlier this year, we identified a need to try to gather as much information as quickly as possible about the impact of the pandemic on oncology practice and on cancer patients, and whether they were experiencing worse outcomes than other patients with COVID-19 and whether their cancer care was being disrupted. So we very quickly, in April this year, stood up ASCO's COVID-19 Registry, which now has enrolled more than 1,000 patients who have both cancer and active COVID infection. And we are monitoring those patients, tracking them longitudinally, and will be reporting soon on some of their outcomes. And right now, people can get some information about that patient population on a dashboard that we have put up on our coronavirus resource page that shows the current status of patients in the registry. So to make a long story short, I got to ASCO with sort of a blank slate. I thought that there was an opportunity for ASCO to more actively engage in conducting research using essentially the 45,000 members of ASCO as a network who could contribute to learning from their experiences as practicing oncologists. And we set out to build the capacity to do that. And as I now contemplate leaving ASCO in the coming months, I think we are well positioned going forward for ASCO to continue to conduct its own research and contribute that to the broader knowledge base that we have in oncology.
And I think you're right there. I mean, there is so much, going to the website of the ASCO organization, there is so much information and so many tools there available, which is very, very comprehensive. Let's take a break. And then we're back with our interview with Dr. Richard Schilsky, the Chief Medical Officer and Executive Vice President of the American Society of Clinical Oncology, ASCO.
Clinical trials allow researchers to introduce new hope by providing participants access to cutting-edge and potentially life-saving treatments. Speak with your doctor and visit standuptocancer.org/clinical trials to learn more. Together, we can stand up for all of us.
This is the Onco'Zine Brief with Peter Hofland.
If you're just joining us, this week I'm talking with Dr. Richard Schilsky, the Chief Medical Officer and Executive Vice President of the American Society of Clinical Oncology, ASCO. Now, talk a little bit about COVID and the pandemic, COVID-19 and the pandemic that we're dealing with right now. You mentioned about the TAPUR study. You mentioned about some of the lessons learned within this study and how it was organized that was also beneficial for looking at different mechanisms and different things, what we deal right now with COVID-19. Focusing on COVID, how did that really impact patients and practices? You mentioned you organized that information. Tell me a little bit more about that.
Well, the thing that became very clear early on, of course, was that people were concerned about going to healthcare facilities because that's where the sick people were, and they were concerned about how that would impact their own risk of contracting COVID-19. I think that's still the case for many people. It was particularly problematic, of course, for cancer patients who were in the midst of treatment, sometimes were debilitated or immune suppressed by their cancer, sometimes were immune suppressed by their cancer treatment, but really could not easily interrupt their cancer treatment because it was life-sustaining for them. And so they were caught in this very difficult position of saying, well, what do I do? Do I stay home from visiting my oncologist to reduce my risk of getting COVID, which could potentially be fatal? Or do I continue my cancer treatment, because it's necessary to keep my cancer under control? It's very challenging and still is very challenging, for both the oncology care teams and the patients. Now, fortunately, most oncologists were able to adapt the way they conduct their practice to be able to continue to treat patients safely, have data from various ASCO sources to suggest that, most cancer treatments were not interrupted in a substantial way, and that patients were able to continue on their prescribed course of therapy. Now, to be sure, cancer patients are vulnerable. We have data in our registry, for example, to suggest that there is an overrepresentation, of patients in our registry who have multiple myeloma and COVID-19 infection, suggesting that, that's a particularly vulnerable population to COVID-19, maybe not surprisingly because they have a primary malignancy of plasma cells, which are necessary for antibody production. But those are the kinds of, insights we have begun to gather as we've been monitoring what's been happening to providers and to patients, either through our registry or through other mechanisms that we have to collect this information.
And that basically is the point where you can guide the physicians that are out there.
Well, the doctors have a really urgent need for information because particularly when the pandemic first hit. I mean, nobody knew what this disease was about. Nobody knew how severe it was, how to manage it, whether or not it was safe to continue with cancer treatment or not, or what the impact would be of interrupting those treatments. And so, we started first by organizing what we call our Coronavirus Resource Center on the ASCO website that brought together as best as we could and as quickly as we could the most reliable information so that oncologists could find all the relevant information in one place. And we continue to keep that up to date even today. But, the analogy to the TAPUR study, as you mentioned it, so just to digress for a second, TAPUR is really a study about learning about the potential utility of targeted therapies when used outside of their FDA-approved indications to treat patients with advanced cancer whose tumor has a genomic alteration that can be targeted by one of these approved drugs. So that's a study that is generating a lot of information. There are more than 2,000 patients who've been enrolled in the study up until now, and we are cranking out the results as quickly as we can. But the analogy with COVID, if you will, was, because nobody really knew how best to treat the viral infection, and there was a lot of information that was being thrown around from all kinds of different sources, people were turning to off-label therapies that could be prescribed, drugs like hydroxychloroquine and others, without necessarily a strong evidence base for using them and without really a mechanism for capturing any information on whether or not they were useful. So that's where, the analogy with TAPUR comes in, because one could have set up early on a COVID study, not unlike what we set up with TAPUR, where, patients were provided access to drugs of potential utility. The drugs were, could have been used in a standardized way, and then standard outcomes could have been captured. And we would have learned very quickly about, the extent to which some of these drugs were useful or not. Eventually, trials along those lines did materialize, like the recovery trial in the UK, is another large, simple, pragmatic clinical trial like TAPUR is. But, I think that that's where I see the analogy of essentially having a mechanism in place to learn from what is going on in clinical practice, but to do it in a way that allows for more organized data collection so that we can have more reliable information.
Would you say that in addition, of course, we're talking here about oncology and hematology, but would you say that developing a mechanism, a workable mechanism that is validated and is powerful may also, and you kind of alluded to a little bit, but it can be translated to other therapeutic areas relatively simply?
Well, sure. I mean, it's TAPUR was all about the developing a pragmatic clinical trial that essentially could be embedded in the clinical workflow, but allow for standardized data collection in a way that we ultimately could draw meaningful information from and publish reliable results. And so there are many areas of medicine where we still have lots of questions, lots of unmet needs, lots of clinical quandaries that we don't have a solid evidence base to address. And yet, doctors are faced with making treatment decisions for their patients every day. But we have not had a mechanism to learn from those treatment recommendations or the experiences of those patients. Now, to some extent, another program that ASCO has developed over the last decade, which has been attempting to do this, is our program we call Cancerlink. Cancerlink is a true, real-world evidence platform where we are collecting prospectively the complete electronic health record on millions of cancer patients. And with that record in hand, we have the ability to then interrogate that and try to draw meaningful conclusions from the experiences of treating those patients in a real-world setting.
But that also, Cancerlink also allows or takes away the silos, more or less, between the clinical research, between approved and non-approved drugs, between researchers and the clinic. Isn't that true?
Well, really, what Cancerlink is doing is really just because we're collecting the complete medical record of many, many patients, it allows us to observe what's going on in clinical practice. And by collating, annotating, collecting, cleaning, curating, and then de-identifying all that data, we then have an enormous data set from which we can draw inferences as to what is working and what is not working, but in a setting that is driven by routine clinical care. I mean, there's nothing about Cancerlink like you might find in a clinical trial where a specific therapy is being tested. We're just observing what doctors are doing in different clinical situations. But from that, we can learn an awful lot.
Now, talking about clinical trials and talking about the regulatory approval of certain drugs, the first thing that comes to mind is, of course, the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA. And the FDA has changed some of the requirements when it comes to clinical data or data from clinical trials. And one of the requirements is that they now want more information relating to women, to children, in addition to the data they normally would have collected in clinical trials. Why is that, in your opinion? Why is that so important?
Well, fundamentally, it's important because the population of people who are treated with any medicine in real-world medical practice is always much broader than the population of people who participate in the clinical trials that lead to approval of those medicines. So there is a knowledge gap between what we've learned from the clinical trials and what we have to apply in regular clinical practice.
Let's take a break, and then we're back with our interview with Dr. Richard Schilsky, the Chief Medical Officer and Executive Vice President of the American Society of Clinical Oncology, ASCO.
The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention is encouraging cancer patients and survivors to be extra cautious during the COVID-19 pandemic. Cancer treatment, especially chemotherapy, weakens the immune system, making you at higher risk of severe illness. Dr. Lisa Richardson is director of the CDC's Division of Cancer Prevention and Control.
Take these steps to stay healthy. Wash your hands often with soap and water. Clean and disinfect frequently touched surfaces daily. Stay home. If you must leave, keep at least 6 feet between you and others. Avoid touching your face, eyes, nose, and mouth with unwashed hands. If your temperature is 100.4 or higher, call your doctor. Use CDC's coronavirus self-checker to help you make decisions about seeking medical care.
Make sure your caregivers and household members are aware of your higher risk and take precautions. Visit cdc.gov/coronavirus and preventcancerinfections.org for more health tips.
This is the Onco'Zine Brief with Peter Hofland.
If you're just joining us, this week I'm talking with Dr. Richard Schilsky, the Chief Medical Officer and Executive Vice President of the American Society of Clinical Oncology, ASCO.
So the more diverse and representative the population of patients are who participate in trials, the more that trial data easily translates into what we do every day in practice. This is, very clear in cancer clinical research, where, for example, something on the order of about 15% of clinical trial participants are age 65 or older, but about 60% of the patients we treat in the clinic are 65 or older. So we have very limited information about the majority of the patients that we treat every day with drugs that have been approved by the FDA. We have the same issues with, patients who have significant comorbidities, many of whom have been excluded from clinical trial participation, but who we still treat every day without really data as to what is the tolerance of the treatment in patients who have those comorbid illnesses. And of course, the same is true for many minority populations who, for various reasons, have been excluded from participating in clinical trials, and yet, are showing up and should show up every day to get a treatment like everybody else, and yet we don't have data that supports the utility of many of the treatments that we wish to use in those particular populations. So I think the FDA is exactly right in working with sponsors to include more diverse patient populations in clinical trials. And of course, ASCO has worked very hard with Friends of Cancer Research over the years to make recommendations as to how to expand and simplify eligibility criteria for clinical trials. And that has resulted in the FDA issuing 5 guidance documents to industry on how to make that happen. So we've been very pleased with the direction that the FDA has moved in. We think it's going to lead to clinical trials that are far more diverse and representative. That will generate the information that ultimately every physician needs to have confidence that the treatment that he or she wants to prescribe is the best treatment for their particular patient.
And I think that's an evolution that we've seen over the last 50 years. Also during your career, a little bit less than 50 years, I believe. talking about 50 years and the anniversary of the 50 years of the National Cancer Act. That's next year. How important has that been in your work, during your career, having a National Cancer Act behind some of the research and the National Institute of Health and the National Cancer Institute in collaboration with societies like ASCO?
Well, I think we are very fortunate as Americans to have an NIH and, for those of us who work in cancer, a National Cancer Institute. There are very few countries in the world that have, a federally funded research enterprise like what we have in the U.S. The National Cancer Institute, of course, existed prior to the signing of the National Cancer Act. But what the National Cancer Act did, in my mind, was really to focus the attention of the nation on cancer as a public health crisis that really needed to be addressed in an organized way with much greater resources and energy than had been the case prior to the signing of the National Cancer Act. Now, what the Act did in practicality was it did direct some additional resources to the NCI, but maybe more importantly, it elevated the role of the director of the NCI to being a position appointed directly by the president, to naming that position as the coordinator of an organized national cancer program. The National Cancer Act also created the NCI-designated cancer centers. And the cancer centers, over the ensuing years, have really become the focal point for all, non-industry sponsored cancer research in this country, doing everything from very basic, fundamental, basic science research to unravel the causes of cancer, all the way through to important population-based studies on care delivery and cancer screening and prevention, and so on. So the Cancer Centers program, which was created by the National Cancer Act, really provided a national infrastructure for bringing researchers together from all fields of science and medicine to focus on the problem of cancer. The last thing I'll say is the National Cancer Act also, I think, reinforced the importance of the cancer clinical trial networks that had been established back in the 1950s, but now were sort of elevated in their importance to the national cancer research infrastructure as publicly funded clinical trial networks that could conduct clinical trials that were important to patients, even if the trials were not important to potential industry sponsors. And that, has provided for a wealth of information that has changed many aspects of cancer practice over the ensuing 50 years.
Now, we are at the end of our program. Before we go, I have one question. So next year you will say goodbye to the ASCO and you will retire. But if you look at the future and maybe 2, 3, 4, maybe 10 years from now, what are some of the things that are still concerning to you? And one of the things comes to mind is maybe disparities in healthcare, but maybe some other things too that come to mind. Tell me a little bit about that, but what keeps you awake at night and what do we need to focus on in the next decade?
Well, for sure, disparities are extremely important because clearly not everybody who needs currently available standards of care is able to get them. And, one of the ways that we can most quickly continue to improve outcomes in cancer in this country is to be sure that every person has access to all standard of care therapies that, are proven to be safe and effective. So that's a big issue. We've made a lot of progress over the years in tobacco control. We still have work to do there, but of course achieving that has really been responsible for a substantial portion of the decline in cancer incidence and mortality over the last 30 or 40 years. We have a lot of work still to do in early detection and in persuading people who should have their cancer screenings done to actually get them done on a regular schedule. And then, of course, we still have a substantial need for new treatments. We've made a lot of progress. We still have a ways to go. It is becoming increasingly clear that, single drug treatments, even when highly targeted and guided by well-validated biomarkers, that's not going to be sufficient to get many advanced cancers under control. Cancers have a remarkable capacity to generate resistance to single drug therapies. So, I think our future is going to be understanding how best to combine targeted therapies or targeted therapies with immune therapies to get the perfect combination of drugs that is highly personalized and highly likely to be effective for each individual. I think we're on the path to achieving that. It's going to be a few years yet before we have the necessary understanding to bring it into practice. But I'm optimistic we're going to get there before too long.
Dr. Schilsky, thank you very much for joining me today for the Onco'Zine Brief. We're looking forward to hearing much more from you in the future, even after you retire. But again, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure talking with you.
In today's edition of the Onco'Zine Brief, I spoke with Dr. Richard Schilsky, the Chief Medical Officer and Executive Vice President of the American Society of Clinical Oncology, ASCO. For more information about the American Society of Clinical Oncology, visit the organization's website at asco.org, that is ASCO.org. For us here at the Onco'Zine Brief, we want to thank you, our listeners, sponsors, and advertisers, for your ongoing support. Your support makes it possible that you can hear this program via PRX, Public Radio Exchange, and in the United Kingdom and mainland Europe via UK Health Radio. You can also download our program via podcast and streaming media, including iTunes and Spotify, and wherever you go to download podcasts. For more information about supporting the Onco'Zine Brief, go to Onco'Zine@onco'Zine.com. If you're living in the United States and want to receive our newsletter, text the word cancer to 66866, and we will make sure that you'll receive our newsletter, which includes an overview of the latest news in oncology and hematology. Thank you all, and thank you for listening. And join us again for our next episode. I'm Peter Hofland, and this is the Onco'Zine Brief.
The Onco'Zine Brief is produced for Sun Valley Communication by Peter Hofland, Sonia Portillo, Evan Wendt, David Kaler, and distributed by InPress Media Group. Support for the Onco'Zine Brief comes from listeners of this station and our commercial underwriters and advertisers. For more information about underwriting and sponsoring options, visit our website at onco'zine.com/underwriting. The Onco'Zine Brief contains health and medicine-related information and is provided for educational and entertainment purposes only. The content is not intended as a substitute for professional medical or health advice and does not replace your doctor's advice. Your doctor is the best person to answer questions about your personal health. If you hear something in this program that doesn't agree with what your doctor has told you, ask him or her about it.